In this video on medieval Islamic bookbinding techniques, I'm going to show you how to do the last step, which is making and attaching the doublures. When I say doublures, what I mean are called paste downs or end sheets in other bookbinding traditions, and they cover the turn-in from the covers, as well as the spine lining where it's attached to the cover boards, which makes it look prettier and also provides some protection to the covers and the spine lining. Before we get started on the doublures though, if you haven't already dealt with the tabs at the spine, we're going to do that now. So I've already cut this one. I'm going to go ahead and cut this one. And you'll notice that the shape it's in right now isn't going to fold nicely into the spine the way we're going to need it to. So we're going to cut these little extra bits off, and we're going to do it on an angle like we did before when we were cutting it initially, so that we're left with something roughly triangular that's pointier at the top than at the bottom, which just makes it easier to fold in where we're going to hide it on the spine. So we're going to open the book. We're going to take our glue. I use the wheat starch paste, but you can use any kind of glue that you've been using so far. You're going to take a little bit of glue. You're going to put it on the tab itself. Just a little bit. And you're going to fold the tab under. You're going to put a little bit of glue there too. Like that. Fold the tab all the way under. Same thing on the other side. Put the glue there to hold it to the rest of the cover. And then we're going to put glue there because we didn't glue the cover to the spine at the top and bottom to make it easier to do this step. If you're working with a leather cover, you can also simply cut them flush or cut them a little bit taller and just fold them over, not tucked all the way in, but just fold it over like a tab. So, on to the doublures. In the medieval period, the doublures were commonly made from leather, especially when the cover was also made from leather. Other options were paper, which could be plain or colored or decorated, usually marbled. And then later in the medieval period, in the Ottoman times, silk was also used sometimes. For the most part, I use paper, such as this one. But I've noticed that paper can be a little challenging sometimes. As you can see with this one, it didn't quite fold correctly. There's another method that was commonly used with leather covers where you could put leather here at the joint in place of paper, and then you would use paper on either side. I adapted this method and use cloth instead of leather, but it works quite well. And then recently, I've begun experimenting with using fabric. Not silk, because silk's expensive, but just normal cotton fabric, and it seems to be working. So I'm going to show you all of those different methods. So we're going to start with paper. We're going to start with the front of the book because the front's the easier one. So for starters, you need a piece of paper. I generally use the same paper that I used for the book itself. And you need a piece the same dimensions. So when we place our doublure, we're going to line it up such that a small amount of the turned in cover is still visible, but only a small amount. We also want to make sure that it lines up top and bottom with the book block. So that's how we're going to line it up. So we take our glue and we apply it to the inside of the cover. You could apply it to the doublure instead, but then you'd have to know exactly how far over to apply it. It's easier to just apply it to the inside cover. And I'm going to apply the glue almost all the way to the edge, leaving just a narrow margin unglued. And for the front cover, the method is the same no matter what material you're using. It's the back that becomes more challenging. You want to make sure that your glue is smooth and doesn't have lumps, because then your doublure will have odd lumps. So I like to apply it on and then go back over it and make sure that I have smoothed all the lumps out. That's more relevant with a starch-based glue rather than PVA, but even with PVA you can sometimes get lumps. And then I'm going to take my paper and line it up. Make sure it lines up top and bottom. And then I'm going to gently smooth it down, starting at the outside and working my way in. What I like to do is take my bone folder, and I will gently hold on to the paper at the edge and use my bone folder to smooth out any remaining lumps, working my way towards the inside of the book. And you'll notice that your spine lining and your turned in covers will make a slight dent in your paper, and that's fine. So now we've got it glued to the cover, but you're still, when it dries, there's going to be an odd little gap here. So the way you solve that is you take a small amount of glue and you run it along the edge here, just in a narrow strip right next to the fold. And we're going to press it down. Fold it up. And then this doublure will form the first page. It's a common technique used in modern hardcover bookbinding. And then to make sure that any glue that may have seeped out around the edge doesn't accidentally glue our book together, we're going to put a piece of parchment paper down and go to the back. Now if I want to do the same thing on the back, I'm going to need a longer sheet of paper. Fortunately, A normal printer size sheet of paper will work, I just have to cut it in the other direction. I need to make sure to cut it the correct width, which for us is 5.5 inches. The other thing that makes the back tricky is this pointed envelope flap. So there's a couple of ways to deal with it. If you happen to have a template, like I do, you can simply place your template on your paper and cut along the lines. If you don't have a template, you can line your paper up. And again, I'm offsetting it. Under there, you can see I'm offsetting it just slightly from the tip. So I want a small amount of my cover to show through. And then I'm going to hold it down in the middle and go find the other end over here. I'm going to fold it back until it looks the way I want it to, and then I'm going to crease it down. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And now I have the lines along which to cut. Go ahead and do that. Then I'm going to double check, just in case. It's always a good idea. Yeah, that looks good. Oh, you guys can't see it. I think it looks good. So, for the back cover, we're going to start at the outside and we're going to work our way in. I'm going to smear the glue almost all the way to the edge, just like before. And if you're using regular PVA glue, you can do this with a brush. If you're using starch-based glues, I find them a lot easier to just apply with my fingers. They tend to be too thick for a brush to do a good job. So I've done just the envelope flap for now. Actually, I'm going to do the envelope and the 4-edge flap. So for the 4-edge flap, I'm applying it to the board on the 4-edge flap, but not down in the creases. Intentionally, at least. I may get some in the creases, but I'm not really trying to. Earlier, you had a choice of whether or not to put a 4-edge board in. If you chose not to, this is probably not the best method. The one I'm going to show you next is better. But if you did put a board in, this method works well. So I'm going to line up my paper. Make sure the top and bottom still aligned with my book block. I'm going to gently press. Take my bone folder and help me make the crease where the joint is between the boards. And the creases in between boards are the tricky part, so take special care with those. And then I'm going to apply the glue to the rest of the board. You could do this all at once. I find that the glue tends to dry very quickly where I'm at, so I do it in stages sometimes. But do whatever works for you. You also want to apply extra glue where the spine lining is, because the linen material will soak up some of the moisture and make the glue less effective. Just like before, I'm going to put a thin, small amount in a thin strip right along the edge here to glue this page to the book block. I'm going to go back to gluing it down. If you don't have a bone folder, you can just do this with your hands or the back end of a butter knife or something similar. Just like that. And then I'm going to put another piece of parchment paper in here. Where's my book? I am also going to want to put a piece of parchment paper in between my doublure and the original first sheet, just in case I accidentally got any glue on a part of the page I didn't mean to get it on. I'm going to do the same thing in the back as well. One thing that you may notice, I'll point it out now, is that the back page is longer than the rest of the book. So once everything is dried, you're going to want to go back in and trim this back page, and you may need to trim the front page a little bit too, so you'll have to keep an eye out for that. And I prefer, when possible, for my books to dry with the flap folded in. Now, the excess paper on the back page might feel a little difficult, but it should be manageable. Fold it up nice and closed. And then it goes in the press until it's dry. And when it's all dry, it should look something like this. The next style I'm going to show you is this one, where there's cloth here in place of more paper. That makes for a more flexible joint, and it takes a little bit of the bulk out as well. Plus it's pretty. Honestly, it's just pretty. And you're less likely to end up with the paper kind of weirdly crinkled around the joints, because the joints are fabric. So for this one, I actually have a tiny little book that I was making for an experiment in something else. So we're going to use this one. So I like to use the same cloth that I used for the cover, but you could use a different cloth if you prefer. For starters, I'm going to trim the raggedy edges off. And I want to make sure that my edges are straight. When choosing a piece of fabric for this, you want to make sure that the fabric is wider than the gap that you are trying to cover, because you're going to glue the fabric down to the two boards, but not to the gap in the middle. I found that works best. The other thing you're going to want is for it to be a little bit longer, because the cleanest way to do this is to fold under a little bit at each edge. So you have a nice, crisp, clean edge here, as opposed to one that could potentially unravel slightly. So I'm going to make mine about that long. I'm going to fold this end under two. And you're going to finger press the edges by just holding them, pressing them tight between your fingers. The heat from your hands will set them slightly. So the first step is going to be cutting the piece of paper that you're going to use for the envelope flap. And you're going to do this the same way you did before. You're going to measure in from the point. Cut along your folds. And you're going to check and make sure that it still looks good. And the second thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that it's going to be slightly shorter than the board that it's going to cover. And that just makes it easier to fold later without ending up with paper that does a weird crinkly thing. I learned that the hard way. Since the fabric that you're going to glue is going to be there, you don't have to worry about it, because the board will be covered there, just not by the paper. I think I need to cut it a little skinnier. As long as the paper and the fabric will overlap, it's not too big a deal how much of a gap you leave. You just want to make sure that there is one. That's better. You can't really see it, but it's better. Okay, the next step is to prep the paper for the other half. In a similar manner, you're going to want to make sure to cut it the right width. If you're just using a normal printer paper sized book, then you can just treat this portion of the back cover like you would the front cover. But since I'm doing an odd sized book, I had to measure it. Okay. And since my paper is not the full width of my book, I'm going to have to do what's called a stub type doublure, which I will show you on the next one because it will be easier to see than the white on white. So the first step for this one is to glue down the fabric that you're going to use. Take a little bit of glue and apply it along the edges next to your gap. It's okay if you get a little overzealous and apply it further out, because you're going to be gluing those down next. You also do want to make sure that you glue it across the gap on the turn-in of the cover. That's to help prevent dust or insects from getting in to your book through the slight gaps there. And then you're going to line up your fabric. Make sure that it's turned under at the ends. And you're going to press down. You want to make sure that you have it on both sides of the gap. If you need to do any adjustments, do them now while the glue is wet and before you've glued the paper. That's why I had it opposite. You want to shoot for having roughly the same amount of fabric on either side, on the boards on either side of the gap. That's more for aesthetics than anything else, because you will be able to see the bump from the cover fabric through your paper. At this point you can let it dry if you prefer. We're going to keep going. You do have to be careful though, since the glue is still wet, the fabric can shift around. So you want to hold it down while you're working to prevent that from happening. And you want to glue a little bit of the fabric, just a skinny little strip, because your paper is going to overlap your fabric. Then we take our paper, we line it up, and we glue it down. And then again, gently smooth it out. You don't want to move things around while you're doing that. Take your bone folder, make everything very nice and smooth. And that's the envelope flap. So now we're going to do the rest of the back cover. And again, you want to be gentle, getting the glue over top of your fabric here in the middle, like so. Then we take our doublure, we line it up. Remember, we don't want to line it all the way at the edge of the board. You want to just overlap the fabric by a little bit, and then hold it down and gently smooth it out. For this particular book, I left a little bit of extra of the cover visible because I didn't cut the width quite exactly the same as the width of the book. Since I'm going to do a stub type doublure anyway, it doesn't matter as much. Since I'm going to do a stub type doublure, I will deal with gluing it down in a little while, because there's a slight difference to that part. So then I would put parchment paper here, fold the whole thing up, and put it in the press as well. Recently, as I mentioned, I've started experimenting with using fabric for the doublures. This is convenient because it works a lot better on the joints than the paper does, and also you have a variety of pretty fabrics. You can find ones that complement the cover, or just that are fun. In the case of a fabric doublure or a leather doublure, I recommend doing either a stub type, which is this kind, or you also have the option to just cut it flush with the edge of the book block and glue it down so that it only covers the cover and doesn't cover any of the book block. You can also, if you want, do fun designs with the stub. You can cut it into triangles or scallops or any kind of fun design you can think of. So the front cover is going to be basically the same as all the other front covers I've shown you, so I will do that later. We're going to do the back cover. It's going to be basically the same as when we did it with paper. So in this case, I'm using fabric that I have backed, the same way that I back the fabric for the covers. For this one, this particular experiment, I used unbacked fabric, and it seems to have worked well. Just make sure, extra sure, that you put parchment paper in between your cover and the rest of your book, because there is some risk that the glue would seep through the fabric. It doesn't appear to have done so in this case, because I don't see any shiny spots, but that is a risk that you take with that method. If you back your fabric first, then that shouldn't happen, but it's still a good idea to put parchment paper down, if only to make sure that any glue that seeped around the edges doesn't get in. So, as before, I'm lining it up near the end of my point, folding it back so I know where to cut it. It's much easier to see with the high contrast here than it was with the white on white paper. And then again, I double check, because if I screwed it up, I can always try again. Once I glue it down, I'm kind of stuck with it. Now, as you can see, I've got a little bit of a rough edge here, so I'm going to trim that off too before we get started. Okay. Check it. Looks good. I'm going to apply my glue. If you're using a thicker doublure material like leather, or if you have a thick decorative paper, or in my case, this is somewhat thicker than the usual material that I use, you need to leave a larger gap here for your, in between your cover boards, forage flatboard and envelope flatboard, to account for that thickness when you fold it up. So you have to plan ahead what you're going to do for your doublure all the way back when you first cut and glue your forage and envelope flatboards. You can always adjust if it turns out that you accidentally glued them a little too close together. You can use a thinner material for your doublure than you originally planned. Or if they're much further apart than they should be, then you could use a thicker material. So there's some ability to adjust, but it's good to plan it out in advance. So I'm going to just quickly cover the whole thing with glue, just like before. Make sure to put some extra on the area with the spine lining. If you are using fabric as a doublure, you may want to use more glue than you would for paper, because again, it will soak up some of the moisture and the glue won't be quite as effective. It's just something to look out for. Alright, Then I'm going to line up the point to where I want it to be. And I screwed it up, so I just sort of gently lift it off. Try again. This works better with cloth, the lifting and moving, than it does with paper, I will note. I'm going to smooth it in. Make sure at my joints, use my bone folder to make sure that the fabric gets in the joints. Like so. Now for a stub type binding, I could simply leave it like this. I would apply glue to the rest of the doublure, press it over, smooth it down. But I want to try doing a little bit of a design on it because I think that would look cute. So I'm going to kind of use this as a rough idea of what I want. I think I'll take it out to about there. And I'm going to line it up like that. So I made myself a little template of how I thought I should do it. I'm just going to take my scissors, cut out around my template. I could also, to make my life a little easier, draw around my template and then take my scissors and cut it out, or put a smaller cutting mat like this one underneath and then cut it with my rotary cutter. But we're just going to use the scissors today. And I'm doing a very simple triangular design. You could do a more complicated scallops or really anything you can think of. If you can think of it and you can cut it out, then you can do it. Alright, and then I'm going to go back in and just snip my corners. If you're going to do fabric and you're going to do a design on your fabric like this, it does help if your fabric is the kind that was backed, because that will help prevent it from fraying. It looks like I didn't get everything lined up quite right, so I'm going to just fix that right now. The other nice thing about doing a fun decorative design in your stub type binding is it doesn't look quite as weird if you didn't quite line things up correctly, top and bottom. So you can just make that part of your design. In fact, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna mirror it on this side. See, looks completely and totally intentional now. So, going to take my glue, and I'm going to apply it. In this case, I'm going to apply it to the back side of the doublure because, especially with the design, it's easier than trying to trace out where it's going to be on the book block and then apply the glue there. It's just easier to apply it to the doublure because then you know exactly where the glue needs to go. I'm going to take my bone folder, gently smooth it towards the center of the book. Smooth out any lumps. I'm going to definitely have to put some parchment paper down here to keep it from gluing itself to itself. So I've got some glue seeping out around the edges. And then you'll have a nice, pretty, decorative doublure. I think it's pretty. And I'll probably do the same zigzaggy design on the front as well when I attach that one. But as I mentioned, the basic attachment is the same as for all of them. The front cover is very easy and straightforward. And there you have it. So at this point, I'll finish the front doublure and then put it in the press with the other books. So this is the last of the videos on the Islamic bookbinding. When you put your book in the press and it dries and you take it out, it'll be done. And you can start using it as a journal and fill it up with all your thoughts. I hope you've had fun making books in the Islamic style. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the videos. Good luck on your bookbinding endeavors.